war. And live Sunday starting at 11, Paul Reed on Winston Churchill, James Goodale on the Pentagon Papers, and activist Medea Benjamin. Live this weekend on Book TV on C-SPAN 2.
Live to the U.S. Senate now as lawmakers are preparing to start their day. General speech is up first, with more work on the Farm Bill expected around 11 o'clock. No deal's been reached yet on amendments, which total over 200. Senators will break between 12:30 and 2:15 p.m. Eastern to attend weekly party caucus lunches. Now live to the Senate floor, here on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. I will lead the Senate in prayer. Let us pray. Because of you, God Most High, we have strength for today and bright hope for tomorrow. Your presence sustains us, even in the midst of storms. Because of you, of God, we face the future confident that you will guide us with the same love with which you've sustained us in the past. Bless our senators. May your spirit be with them, and may your love follow them and their families this day and always. Today, we also thank you for our pages and the good work they do. As their graduation date approaches, bless them with the satisfaction that comes from work well done. We pray in your mighty name. Amen. Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., June 4, 2013. To the Senate. On the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable William M. Cowan, a senator from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Patrick J. Leahy, President Pro Tempore.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
Following remarks of my remarks and those of Senator McConnell, will be in a period of morning business for 1 hour. The majority will control the first half, Republicans the final half. Following that morning business, Senate will resume consideration of the Farm Bill. The Senate will recess today from 12:30 until 2:15 to allow for our weekly caucus meetings. Mr. President, first of all, thank you very much for giving the prayer. Our pastor who was supposed to give the prayer was not here. You stepped in and you did a wonderful job. We're all very proud of you, and on today, especially proud of Governor Duvall for appointing you. You've done such a remarkably good job. We know that in 2 or 3 weeks there's an election to fill this spot, but your mark will be known as being one of the nicest people and one of the most competent people I've served with here in my many years in Congress. So thank you very, very much. Mr. President, this week we will say goodbye, the Senate, to a valued friend and a colleague, Senator Frank Lautenberg. A funeral for Frank will be in New York. He's a great American success story and the Senate's last World War II veteran. As I indicated, tomorrow we will be in the New England to recognize his passing, a celebration of his life. And later in the week, it's pretty clear that he will be buried in Arlington Friday afternoon. Senator Lautenberg loved this institution, where he spent more than 3 decades, and he would understand its work must go on despite our sorrow. This week, work continues on the Farm Bill that will create jobs, cut taxpayer subsidies, and reduce the deficit. Chairman Stabenow and Ranking Member Cochran have worked very hard to come up with a finite list of amendments. They're still trying to do that. I hope they can complete that today. I'm going to give the managers as much time as we can to reach an agreement to consider a finite list of amendments to the Farm Bill. And I won't file cloture unless I have spoken more than once before the day's out to Senator Stabenow and Senator Cochran. because I would hope that I wouldn't have to file cloture on this legislation tonight. We need to move forward, though. It's important to leave ample time for debate on the bipartisan immigration bill reported by the Judiciary Committee just a few weeks ago. And the Senate must move before the end of June to protect students from the rising cost of education by keeping the loan rates low. If we don't do something about that before the end of this month, it's going to more than double the rates. If we do nothing, it will double the rates. If we do what the House wants, it'll triple the rates. So we can't do that. College is already unaffordable for too many young people. And if Congress fails to take action this month, I've indicated, and it certainly I underline and underscore the fact that the price tag will go up significantly for them. With what is suggested by the House and the legislation they've passed, they will add about $6,500 to the average student's loan bill. That proposal would be worse than doing nothing, worse than letting rates double next month. So I hope my Senate Republican colleagues will instead support our efforts to give middle-class families security by freezing interest rates at current levels for 2 years without adding a penny to the deficit. This is exactly the kind of common-sense proposal we need to keep our economy growing. And I'm going to do everything I can to have a vote on the student loan bill this week. If the Republicans want to put forward here in the Senate what they think should be done, I'd be happy to have vote on theirs. We'll vote on ours. But even if we've not completed action on the Farm Bill or the student loan proposals, we're going to bring immigration to the fore next week. The immigration system is broken, needs to be fixed. And I'm grateful that Senator McConnell said that he wouldn't oppose moving to the bill, that he, at least as way I read the press, he doesn't believe that we'll need to do cloture on the bill. So I hope we don't need to get on the bill. If we do, I will do that. I know he can't control virtually every Republican, but I would hope that we could move forward and start the debate on this bill. During the recess, Mr. President, I had the opportunity to appear at a number of events in Nevada. And each one of those events, the topic of conversation was immigration. I appeared at an event in Las Vegas where we had 1,000 or 2 people on the streets, and it was really a moving event. This has always been a personal issue for me, as I've said many, many times, Mr. President. My father-in-law immigrated from Russia. I've seen firsthand, with a huge increase in people coming to Nevada over the last 15 or 20 years, the large numbers of people who have been devastated by our broken immigration system. I personally have devoted more time to immigration reform than any other issue over my career in Congress. But each time I meet with my constituents, they're desperate for common sense reform. Each time I do that, my passion for fixing our immigration system, which is broken, is renewed. Mr. President, this becomes personal for a lot of reasons. But I always remember when there was a lot of anti-immigration stuff going on here in Congress, I went home to my Washington home, and my wife said, "Remember who I am. Remember why I'm here." My dad came from Russia, or words to that effect. I got the message very quickly, Mr. President. And from that brief conversation with Landra, I became an advocate for fixing our broken immigration system. Now, I believe that my father-in-law contributed a lot to this country. But I know one thing he contributed. His only child is now the mother of my 5 children and the grandmother of 16 grandchildren. So this issue is something that's important to me. And I admire and respect the work of the 8 senators, 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats. So we need to move forward on this legislation. It's so very, very important. I appeared not only at that huge event in Las Vegas where there were thousands of people, I appeared in a Catholic church last week in Reno. 1,500 people filled that church. People were standing outside. The 1,500 didn't count toward those people who were outside. This is a forum organized by faith leaders, not just Catholics, all faiths were there, who believe immigration reform is not a political issue but a moral issue. They don't believe that it's an economic issue or a political issue. I repeat, they believe it's a moral issue, and I agree. A Catholic priest from Carson City shared the story of his grandparents who immigrated from Italy. So, Mr. President, as I already indicated, like my wife's parents who immigrated from Russia, my father-in-law at least, my mother-in-law barely made it here before she almost was an immigrant, but she was a little baby born in someplace in Canada. Mr. President, families coming here from other countries need to understand what the law is, and we're trying to determine that. That's our job. Today, immigrant families come seeking the same thing as generations before them. Just like my father-in-law, Israel Goldfarb, who came here, changed his name, Mr. President. He became Earl Gould. That's the only person I ever knew. He died as a young man, and he didn't get to enjoy his grandchildren. So, Mr. President, there are lots of reasons why we have to fix the broken immigration system we have and help the many that are undocumented here get right with the law. It's time for reform that helps them contribute fully to their communities by learning English, paying taxes, and starting down the pathway to earn citizenship. The bill that we have from the Judiciary Committee is not a perfect bill, Mr. President, but we don't have them here. There's never been, in my more than 3 decades here in Congress, never been a perfect bill that came here. The Founding Fathers could envision non-perfect bills. They knew that's how we would get things done, by compromise. Legislation is the art of compromise. So it's up to us to ensure America remains a land of opportunity for people born within our borders as well as those who seek a better future on our shores. Finally, Mr. President, on another subject. Ads have been run on TV and radio and newspaper ads about the Democrats needing to follow here in the Senate regular order, and we have done that. But now, my Republican colleagues are silent. We've been waiting for months now to allow them to allow us to go to conference for regular order. They are refusing to go to conference so that we can come up with a budget, that we can negotiate with the House as to what we should do. Now, Mr. President, it's obvious why we are not being able to go to conference. It's so obvious. The Speaker does not want us to go to conference, and the Republicans in the Senate are trying to protect him in his unwieldy job he has over there, trying to protect his job and what they're trying to do from the Tea Party people that are wreaking havoc with our country. We should be able to go to conference. Republicans have come here and said, Republican senators, let's go to conference. What's stopping us from going to conference? I've just told you what's stopping us from going to conference, and it's really being detrimental to our country.
President.
The Republican leader.
I want to associate myself with the remarks of the Majority Leader with regard to our late colleague Frank Lautenberg. He was indeed a member of the greatest generation, having fought in World War II and also distinguished service here in the Senate. I would also like to mention to my friend the Majority Leader before he leaves the floor that I'd indicated to him before the recess that I intended to bring up each day going forward the commitment he made to the Senate back in January of 2011 and again in January of 2013, the last 2 Congresses, the beginning of the last 2 Congresses, with regard to using the nuclear option to change the rules of the Senate. The most important currency of the realm here in the Senate is your word. And my good friend, the Majority Leader, said in January of 2011, and I quote, "I will oppose any effort in this Congress or the next to change the Senate's rules other than through the regular order." It was not a contingent commitment. It was not a contingent based upon my judgment about good behavior. It was a commitment. And then again in January 2013, in an exchange the Majority Leader and I had on the floor, I said I would confirm with the Majority Leader that the Senate would not consider other resolutions relating to any standing order or rules of this Congress unless they went through the regular order process. That was my question to my friend, the Majority Leader, to which he replied, that is correct. Any other resolutions related to Senate procedure would be subject to a regular order process, including consideration by the Rules Committee. So, Mr. President, my point is a commitment has been made, an unequivocal commitment has been made. And in the Senate, of course, how we deal with all issues are related to keeping our word. And it'll be important for the Senate to understand before we go much further this year just what the Majority Leader's intentions are. Does he plan to keep his word issued in January 2011 and January 2013 or not? I think the Senate is entitled to an answer to that. All senators would be interested in an answer to that, but particularly the minority would be interested in an answer to that before we go any further into this session. Now, with regard to the loan rates for students, I think it's interesting to note here as we go into this needless controversy, because we're really not that far apart, one of the driving reasons for the increase in student loan rates. Two of them are directly related to the passage of Obamacare. In Obamacare, the Democratic majority, without a single Republican vote, abolished the student loan program. The government took it over and raised the rates. So that's one reason rates are going up. The second reason is the Medicaid mandate. The Medicaid mandate, which the Supreme Court said is optional, but states are now wrestling with whether or not to accept this additional responsibility for vast new numbers of Americans who would receive a free health care card. The two biggest items in every state budget are Medicaid and education. And as Medicaid expenses rise, what state governments all across America have done is reduce educational funding to public colleges and universities. In response to that, the colleges and universities raise tuition. So the new generation coming along is getting it both ways. The rates are going up and the tuition's going up. So they have to pay back more at a higher rate, all related to something young people had nothing to do with, which was the passage of Obamacare. Now, Washington's had to grapple with a lot of big issues the past few years, and we've had some pretty heated debates because there were real philosophical differences over how to address those challenges. That's why it's so nice to work on an issue where the two parties are in relative agreement. We're not that far apart on this student loan issue now. Neither party wants to see the rates rise in July, and both the President and Republicans generally agree on the way to make that happen. So there's no reason we should be fighting over this issue at this particular point. There's no reason the President should be holding campaign-style events to bash Republicans for supposedly opposing him on student loans when we're in agreement on the need for a permanent reform, when the plan we put forward is actually pretty similar to his own. Yet somehow that's just what we saw last Friday down at the White House. Well, that's certainly not going to help the students. I mean, having a true policy debate is one thing, but provoking a partisan squabble seemingly for its own sake is frankly just ridiculous. Our constituents sent us here to govern, not try to pick fake fights in some crusade to restore Nancy Pelosi to her speakership. What I'm saying to the President and my Democratic friends is this: let's put the politicking aside. There's no reason for a fight here. So I hope we can finally get to work. Students are counting on us to actually get something done. So here's a quick rundown of where we are on the issue. There's a Senate Democratic plan, but everyone knows it's just a political bill, a short-term fix that would only apply to less than half of the students who plan to take out new loans. And it would impose permanent tax hikes in return for a temporary plan for half the students. Let me repeat that. Another temporary fix paid for with a permanent tax hike. Even the President has dismissed this approach. So in my view, it's really not worth much of a discussion at this point. The fact is, The proposals Republicans put forward are actually closer to what President Obama has asked for. We both agree on the need for permanent reform that takes the decisions on interest rates out of the hands of politicians. The House has already passed a bill that would achieve those two goals. And Senate Republicans have put forward a bill that is also similar to the President's proposal, as both our plans would employ a variable market rate that, like a mortgage, doesn't change over the life of an individual student's loan. The President said he opposed a bill that didn't lock in rates. Ours gives students the certainty that the President agrees they should have. So if the President were really serious about getting this done, he would have spent that time on Friday ringing up senators to see how he could bridge our relatively small differences, not having a press conference and bashing Congress. This is one issue where both parties can find quick agreement, but only if Washington Democrats have the will to do so. Young Americans already have enough to worry about. They don't need Washington creating even more problems for them. The youth unemployment rate for 20 to 24-year-olds is over 13%. In Kentucky, it's more than 14%. And once many students graduate from college, they face a highly uncertain future. So the President has a choice to make. Does he push some campaign issue for 2014, or does he want to address a problem here and prevent the rate increase? Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business for 1 hour, with the time equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, with the majority controlling the first half.
Mr. President.
The Assistant Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I've listened carefully to the statement made by the Republican leader, and it was interesting to me when he talked about the issue of increased costs for colleges, that the tuition's gone up and we have a student loan issue that's coming up on interest rates, perhaps doubling. And it was interesting that the Republican leader said, and the root cause of the problem, Obamacare. Well, it turns out, if you listen to the statements and speeches from the Republican side of the aisle, if your car won't start, Obamacare. Too many pop-ups on your computer, Obamacare. Basically, it turns out that every problem in America can be traced to Obamacare. Obamacare, of course, is a Health Care Reform Act, which said, incidentally, that students in college can stay on their parents' health insurance plan until they reach the age of 26, Obamacare. It also said that those who are receiving prescription drugs under Medicare will pay less, Obamacare. It went on to say that you can't discriminate against people when it comes to health insurance if they have a pre-existing medical condition, Obamacare. So what we hear from the Republican side of the aisle, any problem we have, too much rain in the Midwest, Obamacare. It reaches a point where it strains credibility. Here's what the reality is. July 1st, the interest rates on student loans, on subsidized loans, double, from 3.4% to 6.8% if we do nothing. Now, the Republicans in the House of Representatives said, well, we've got a better plan. It's a plan which the Republican leader in the Senate just spoke to. We're going to move the interest rates, we're going to tag them to this and peg them to this. The next thing you know, it turns out the interest rate coming out of the Republican bill in the House is higher than 6.8%. In other words, if we did nothing, as opposed to the Republican plan, students would be better off. But we have a better idea. We're going to do our best to make sure that we preserve the 3.4% interest rate on subsidized student loans. Is it important? It's critically important. Look what's happening to students across America today. A lot of young people listen to their parents, listen to their teachers, and all their friends say, go to college, get a degree. It's good advice. Then they go to sit down and figure out what it's going to cost, and it turns out to be pretty expensive. I look back on my college education. I won't tell you what my student loans were. They will date me. But I was scared to death when I ended up with this huge student loan at the end of law school when I accumulated it all together. Said to my wife at the time, I don't know if we'll ever be able to pay this back. It's so big. It was $8,500. $8,500 for college and law school. But it was more than half of my first year's income, putting things in perspective. Now look what students are faced with. The average for-profit college costs $30,900 a year in tuition fees. Now these for-profit schools, I'll talk about in a minute, are the most expensive schools in America. They're the ones who are trying to lure students into their schools that they're offering. The biggest ones are the University of Phoenix, which has more students than the combined enrollment of all the Big Ten universities, Kaplan University, which owns the Washington Post, DeVry out of Chicago, and a variety of others. They can't wait to see these students coming out of high school and to sign them up for these for-profit schools, the most expensive schools in America. There's something else about those schools. They have the highest student loan default rates. They charge the students too much for tuition. They offer them too little by way of education and training. A lot of kids drop out, and even those that finish can't find a job. They default on their student loans, for-profit schools. But take a look at the cost of education in general. Most students, unless they're lucky with parents that have a lot of money in the bank, have to borrow money. And if they have to borrow it, the question is, what do they pay when it comes to the interest on the student loans? Private loans, not the government loans, but private college loans can have interest rates up to 18%. So unless you've taken a course in consumer economics or business in high school, you may not know what the difference is between 3.4% interest on your loan and 18% interest. Believe me, it's dramatic. And so students are faced with this reality. Well, the question obviously is, what's Congress going to do about it? If we're going to continue keeping the interest rate at an affordable level, 3.4% for student loans, then we're going to have to take action before July 1st. If we do nothing, it will double. If we do nothing, students will pay thousands of dollars more in paying off their loans. How big is student loan debt in America? Student loan debt in America is larger than credit card debt. It's over $1 trillion and one of the fastest growing areas of debt in America. And as students get encumbered by this debt, obligated by this debt, many don't realize what they're up against. This is not like any other loan you can take out. Any loan that you take out for a car or a house or to buy a washer and a dryer is dischargeable in bankruptcy. If your finances go completely in the tank and you go to a bankruptcy court, those other loans go away, but not student loans. There are only 4 things that cannot be discharged in bankruptcy: taxes that you owe the government, alimony, child support, and student loans. And what it means is the decision made by the 19 or 20-year-old about debt to go to school is a decision for a lifetime. It's going to stick with you for a lifetime. And when the parents sign on as guarantors on these student loans, or grandparents, they're on the hook too. And if the student ends up dropping out of school, no debt, plenty of debt, no diploma, they're in a bad situation. Still have to pay off the loans. What we're trying to do on the Democratic side is to keep the interest rate on these loans as low and affordable as possible. I think that's only reasonable. You know, why make it any harder for these students and their families? The Republican side, sadly, more than doubles the interest rate on student loans. That's a worthy debate. I know the side that I'll be on. I think most Americans know what side we should all be on. Try to keep the cost of these loans closer to being under control. Try to keep them at the 3.4% level. Now, Jack Reed of Rhode Island recently introduced the Student Loan Relief and Refinancing Act, which would prevent the interest rate hike by moving federal student loans back to the market-based variable rate as it was prior to 2007. Jack Reed's bill would offer adjustable interest rates for federal student loans and Parent Plus loans with a cap of 6.8% for subsidized loans and 8.25% for unsubsidized and Parent Plus loans. Rates would be set every year based on the 91-day Treasury bill plus a percentage determined by the Secretary of Education to be necessary to cover program administration and borrower benefits. The bill is revenue neutral. It will help current borrowers by allowing those stuck with high fixed-rate federal student loans to refinance their loans into new variable-rate loan with a cap. Many students signed up for loans that were a bad deal, and they want to change them, but they're stuck with them. So this Reid bill gives them a chance to refinance. Congress should consider a long-term interest rate fix, but we need to act quickly to stop the interest rates from doubling on July the 1st. We have a good short-term patch that will extend the current 3.4% interest rate for 2 years, maybe a year or 2 years. The bill is fully paid for by closing 3 tax loopholes. Senator McConnell was on the floor here complaining that we are doing tax code changes to pay to keep the interest rates low. Well, here are a couple of the changes he was complaining about. Our proposal would include a tax on the oil and gas companies for tar sands so that they would put more money into the oil spill liability trust fund. That's one of the things that Senator McConnell said is not appropriate. The other one would close a tax loophole that allows non-U.S. companies to reduce their U.S. tax liability on income from their sales in the U.S. I don't think that's unreasonable, particularly if the money that we're getting from that will help subsidize a low interest rate on student loans. This bill's a temporary solution, I understand, but it's going to save students in my state, like Illinois, $1,000, at least $1,000, by keeping the interest rate low in terms of what they'll pay back over a lifetime. Now, the complicated proposal that came out of the House of Representatives, the Republican proposal, as I said, will more than double the interest rates for students that they're going to face. And parents are going to have a higher liability on their loans that they sign up for their students in their family, and that, to me, is not a good outcome either. There have been proposals that have been pushed by some of my Republican colleagues, Senators Coburn, Burr, and Alexander, which would adjust the interest rates annually for both subsidized and unsubsidized loans, and it would be, like the House bill, House Republican bill, an increase of 3% over the 10-year Treasury rate. There are no caps, incidentally, on where that interest rate's going to go, so the students could have a liability much greater in the future. Here's what it boils down to. If you believe that education is important, and I think everyone does, if you believe college education is a ticket for a better life and a better opportunity to contribute to this country, and most people do, we want to make sure it's affordable for students from working income homes and middle income homes. And that's why we want to keep this interest rate low. The Republican proposals, all of the Republican proposals, dramatically raise the student loan interest rate beyond the level Democrats are pushing for. We've heard a lot of comment on the floor. There'll be a lot of debate on the floor about a lot of other issues, the IRS and other things like that. They're all worthy issues, worth talking about. But if you talk to the average family in my state of Illinois or around the country, they're going to tell you something like a student loan debate is much more important to them. We want to be on the side of working to help middle income and those families that are working for a living, give those families a chance to send their sons and daughters to college, to have a better life in the future, and don't burden them with a loan that is impossible for them to pay back. I want to close by saying a word about one category of schools that I mentioned earlier, the for-profit schools. We have in our country not-for-profit schools that include private universities as well as public universities, colleges and universities. Then there is a for-profit sector of higher education. I mentioned the leaders earlier, University of Phoenix and Kaplan and DeVry as 3 of the biggest in the United States. Currently, our federal government is subsidizing these for-profit schools in ways that most taxpayers wouldn't believe. Right now, what these schools are bringing in is 75, 80, 85, and 90% of their revenue directly from the federal treasury. In other words, students come in and turn over their Pell Grants, sign up for their government loans, and all of this government money flows into these for-profit schools. Now, many of these schools offer valuable courses, but many of them are worthless. Many of them, unfortunately, burden these young people with debt and offer them nothing by way of education or training so that they can have a better life. And as a result, the students end up with a mountain of debt they can't pay back, and they default on the debt. Here are the numbers to keep in mind. There are 3 basic numbers which explain the for-profit education industry in America. 12% of high school graduates go to for-profit schools. 25% of all the federal aid to education goes to for-profit schools. Over $30 billion a year to for-profit schools. They'd be the 9th largest federal agency if you just took for-profit schools and private sector by themselves, over $30 billion. They'd be the 9th largest, but they are a private company, a for-profit company. The third number to remember is 47. 47% of all the student loan defaults are by students in for-profit schools. That number tells the story. These poor students are being loaded with debt, and they're being given an education that isn't worth it. At the end, they can't pay back their debt, and they default on those debts. That's the reality of where we are today. In just a few weeks, July 1st, if we do nothing, interest rates on loans at all schools for government loans are going to double. If we do something, we can continue to protect students. But in addition to that, we have to do something about higher education and what's happening here. It isn't just the for-profit schools, many of which are ripping off these students. It's the overall cost of higher education. It is going beyond the reach of average families across America. I look back to my own life experience, and thank goodness that I had a chance to borrow the money and go to school, get an education, end up, as I say, with a full-time government job. But the bottom line is other people deserve the same opportunity. And if you aren't from a wealthy family, you should be able to borrow the money to be able to get through school and make a success of your life. Let's do our part here. Let's stand behind the working families. Let's support the Democratic approach, which will keep the interest rates at 3.4%. Let's reject the Republican approach that would more than double these interest rates on these students and their families. Let's give these young people a fighting chance to get a good education and an opportunity to prosper in this great nation. Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
The Assistant Majority Leader,
I ask consent the quorum call be suspended.
without objection.
Mr. President, last week we lost a Chicago original. Father Andrew Greeley was a Catholic priest in Chicago and a man of great accomplishment. He was a best-selling author, college professor, newspaper columnist, and a sociologist at the University of Chicago. Most importantly, according to Father Greeley, he was, quote, just a priest. Andrew Moran Greeley was born in Oak Park, a suburb west of Chicago. By the time he was in the 2nd grade at St. Angela's Elementary School, he knew he wanted to be a Catholic priest. After being ordained, he served as an assistant pastor at Christ the King Parish in Chicago and studied sociology at the University of Chicago. He was released from archdiocesan duties to pursue his academic interest in 1965, but he remained a priest in good standing the rest of his life. Although he never led a parish, Father Andrew Greeley regularly filled in at St. Mary the Woods Church in Edgebrook. And he would lead Mass, preach, hear confessions, and officiate at weddings and baptisms. But what brought Andrew Greeley international recognition was his work as a writer, an author. He built an international assemblage of fans over a career spanning 5 decades. Of the 60 novels that Father Greeley wrote, some were considered scandalous with their portraits of hypocritical and sinful clerics. But he also wrote more than 70 works of nonfiction, often on the sociology of religion. His clear writing style, consistent themes, and celebrity stature made him a leading spokesman for generations of Catholics. Father Greeley enjoyed being a sociologist and a commentator on current affairs. For much of his career, he divided his time between Chicago and Tucson, Arizona, where he taught at the University of Arizona. He also achieved prominence as a journalist, writing a weekly column for the Chicago Sun-Times and contributing regularly to American and international publications. His weekly columns touched on all sorts of issues, from critiquing the Catholic Church to the war in Iraq. Father Greeley was unapologetic in a tell-it-like-it-is Chicago style. In July of 1986, Father Greeley wrote the first of many columns in the Chicago Sun-Times about allegations of sexual abuse by a Roman Catholic priest. His thoroughly honest and powerful reporting alerted the nation to this scandal way ahead of many others. It forced the church to acknowledge that it had a problem and a problem it had to solve. His opposition to the war in Iraq and a war on terror was so deep-seated that he compiled his writings and published them in a book. It was meekly titled, quote, "A Stupid, Unjust, and Criminal War, Iraq 2001 to 2007. He gave me that autographed copy of that book. Needless to say, Father Greeley rarely thought twice about holding back from saying what he thought. He was criticized by his early critics for never having had an unpublished thought, but his ability to convey his opinion was also what made him successful in connecting with readers all over the world. He had a popular approach to writing that interested people on issues that they normally wouldn't connect with. He attended Quigley Prep in Chicago, received his licentiate in sacred theology in 1954 from St. Mary the Lake Seminary in Mundelein, and was ordained in '54 as well. He continued his love of learning by earning a master's degree in 1961, a doctorate in 1962, with a study on the effect of religion on the career paths of 1961 college grads. His scholarship led to his longtime position as a senior researcher on the staff of the university's National Opinion Research Center, which surveys American opinion on religion and other issues. Later in life, after finding success as a novelist and published sociologist, Father Greeley created a foundation to help inner-city kids with a $1 million grant to distribute money to Catholic schools in Chicago with high minority enrollments. Father Greeley's other lifelong love, besides the church, his family, and his writing, was the great city of Chicago. He was a classic example of what Chicagoans call a lifer, someone who never felt at home anywhere other than the Windy City. Father Greeley was fond of the different architecture and sculpture atop ordinary buildings around Chicago, places that common working people lived, but which were adorned with beautiful handmade workmanship. He would take pictures of these buildings and sculptures and loved to show them off. He was a great fan of the Chicago Bulls and the Bears, and he never stopped praying that the Cubs would one day win another pennant. Father Greeley wanted people to think of him as an honest and humble priest, but he was truly one of a kind. He touched and enriched so many lives. I remember having lunch with him several years ago. He was just one of a kind, a Catholic priest who was part of the world, part of the world's conversation, but still dedicated to his vocation. I send my condolences to his sister, Mary Jewel Durkin, his 5 nieces and 2 nephews. Father Greeley blessed us with his presence for many wonderful years. His passing is a great loss to the people of Chicago and to his friends and fans all over the world. Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
Senator from Louisiana.
Mr. President, I ask consent to speak in morning business up to 12 minutes.
Senate's in a quorum call.
Excuse me, Mr. President. In that case, Mr. President, I ask consent to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
And now I ask consent to speak in morning business for up to 12 minutes.
Without objection.
And, Mr. President, I ask further consent to bring onto the floor and display a box of home keys, which I'll explain in a moment.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, as is obvious, the people of South Louisiana have been through a whole lot in the last several years. Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Rita, many significant hurricanes since then, most recently Hurricane Isaac, and the BP oil disaster, to name just a few really trying tragedies. But now, Mr. President, having survived all of that, having endured through all of that, many residents of South Louisiana think they face a challenge that is even greater, and that is completely, wholly man-made. And that is the challenge presented by new changes to the National Flood Insurance Program, which many South Louisiana residents fear could make their staying in their homes that they built, following all the rules every step of the way, that could make that unaffordable. And that's a crying shame, Mr. President. We must avoid that happening at all cost. First of all, Mr. President, let me underscore. I talk about the folks of South Louisiana because I represent them, because they've been through so much. But this is a national concern which potentially affects tens of millions of residents all around the country in every one of the 50 states. And that, too, is a reason we must solve this problem. And again, Mr. President, it's simple. When we reauthorized the National Flood Insurance Program last year, when we finally got past only renewing that program by fits and starts for very short-term periods, we put into the law several reforms that were supposed to make the program fiscally sound. However, as some of those reforms are beginning to be implemented, they threaten to produce sky-high flood insurance premiums that no one at the time we debated these changes, no one at FEMA, no one in private insurance, no outside expert forecast. And these sky-high premiums, if they're allowed to happen, threaten two things. First of all, they threaten, as I said, many good, hard-working taxpayers, residents who have followed all the rules every step of the way in building their homes and renovating their homes and buying flood insurance. It threatens their being able to stay in their homes. It threatens the affordability of their living that big part of the American dream. And second, Mr. President, that threatens making the National Flood Insurance Program sound, because if significant numbers of folks can't stay in their homes, can't afford flood insurance, can't pay into the system, and therefore leave the system, potentially turn over their keys to the bank, walk away, certainly leave the National Flood Insurance System, perhaps leave home ownership. That is a big defeat for the fiscal soundness of the National Flood Insurance Program as well. About 2.5 weeks ago, Mr. President, I was in Bayou Gauche. That's a middle-class neighborhood in St. Charles Parish, Louisiana, up the river from New Orleans. And I stood in the driveway of a home owned by homeowners who are facing just this crisis, just this challenge. Now, as I said a few minutes ago, they have survived a whole lot over the last several years. Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Rita to their west, many major hurricanes since then, including most recently Hurricane Isaac and the BP oil spill, the BP disaster. They have survived more than they ever imagined was possible in a lifetime. And yet now they're fearful that their greatest challenge is yet ahead, and their greatest challenge is completely man-made, the fact that some of these new changes to the National Flood Insurance Program could cost them their house, could make their staying in that solid middle-class neighborhood at their house unaffordable. When I was there, when we were talking about this challenge with many, many local residents and leaders, those homeowners presented me with this box of keys. It's pretty heavy, but I want you and everyone on the floor to see. These are hundreds and hundreds of house keys that have been put in this box by homeowners who face the same threat, who say if the right reforms and changes aren't made, they're handing over these keys. They're handing them over to FEMA. They're handing them over to the federal government. They're handing them over to the bank because their homes will no longer be affordable. They have to have flood insurance if they have any mortgage. Virtually everybody has to have a mortgage to afford their house over time. And if flood insurance rates go sky high and are literally unaffordable, they'll be handing over these keys for good. Now, Mr. President, they all know and expect that there are going to have to be changes to the program and some significant increases for the program to be fiscally sound and pay for itself. They're not arguing with that. I'm not arguing with that. What we're arguing against is completely unaffordable premium increases, things that will literally drive middle-class families out of their homes and out of their neighborhoods and make their American dream completely unaffordable. That shouldn't be allowed to happen. Shouldn't be allowed to happen because it's wrong to give them that uncertainty and that future when they have followed the rules every step of the way as they existed under the National Flood Insurance Program, under their mortgage, under everything else. And it shouldn't be allowed to happen because it will mean we will never achieve fiscal sustainability for the system if thousands and tens of thousands and potentially hundreds of thousands of people around the country exit the program as is threatened to do. We need to take action to be able to ensure these homeowners that that won't happen to them. And with that goal in mind, Mr. President, I'm pursuing several things. First of all, some of this can and must be fixed administratively at FEMA. And I've led several delegations to FEMA to talk about this, to demand that they do what they can under their authority, particularly under the so-called LAMP process, to make sure they get it right, particularly in drafting and issuing new flood maps. LAMP is the new process that is underway at FEMA, under which they're supposed to take into account in making new maps all flood protections, all features that are there on the ground to provide homeowners under that terrain flood protection, even if it is less than a 100-year level of protection. FEMA is still in the midst of their LAMP process. They're not finished by a long shot. And we have to make sure that FEMA gets that right, builds all protections and features into their new maps before any of those new maps and any of those new rates take effect. That's just the biggest example of what FEMA needs to do to get it right, what they can do under their authority. Part of this challenge is definitely administrative, and that's why I've led those groups to FEMA and why FEMA needs to get it right. That's also why I'll be presenting this box of home keys to FEMA later this week at the request of these Louisiana homeowners. And, Mr. President, the other part of our challenge is that we get it right legislatively, because in addition to everything FEMA can and must do, there probably also needs to be changes to Biggert Waters to ensure that homeowners aren't thrown out of their homes because flood insurance is now unaffordable. And that's why I've teamed up with the Senior Senator from Mississippi, Thad Cochran, in introducing the Vitter-Cochran measure to fix these provisions in the National Flood Insurance Program. It will do several things, at least four, that are significant. First, ensure that communities who are developing new maps by the end of this year will be able to maintain the old grandfathered rates that are subject to change in Section 207 of Biggert Waters. Second, the bill would allow a 5-year phase-in of actuarially sound rates for newly purchased homes to require a reasonable phase-in to those higher rates. Third, the bill would authorize state and local governments flexibility to directly subsidize homeowners' flood insurance properties if that can be part of the solution as well. And fourth, it would require a minimum of 25% of mitigation funding go directly to homeowners in a given year for programs and help that directly impact homeowners like home elevation. I'll be advancing that bill along with Thad Cochran, along with many other interested members, and will also be looking for amendment opportunities to advance those ideas and those provisions as well. And certainly I'm joining with my other colleagues from Louisiana, from the Sandy-hit area in the Northeast, from all parts of the country to advance these fixes. Senator Landrieu has an amendment on the Farm Bill on the Senate floor now that I'm a co-sponsor of. I'm certainly working with her and many other members to get this fixed, to get it done, to reassure these threatened homeowners that help is on the way. Mr. President, we need to do this. We need to preserve the American dream and treat these people right, not make their middle-class homes and middle-class neighborhoods all of a sudden, through no fault of their own, unaffordable. And we need to do it, Mr. President, for the very goal of putting the National Flood Insurance Program on a fiscally sound footing. Because if we have tens or hundreds of thousands of residents exiting the program, turning their keys over, turning them into FEMA, turning them into the bank, the National Flood Insurance Program will never get to that fiscally sound basis. You'll have people exiting the system no longer able to pay premiums. We need to get it right for them. We need to get it right for the American dream, and I look forward to working with all of our colleagues in doing so. Because again, Mr. President, I started at the beginning talking about what South Louisiana has been through, many hurricanes and the BP disaster and more. But this is not a parochial issue. It's not a Katrina issue. It's not a Sandy issue. It's far broader than that. This movie is coming to a theater near you. And I urge you to learn about that threatened impact on your constituents, on your homeowners, and to immediately join me and many others in this effort. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
The Republican whip.
Mr. President, I join others of our colleagues in mourning the passing of our friend and former colleague, Senator Frank Lautenberg. Senator Lautenberg joined this body in 2003 for the second time. And I was immensely struck by his tenacious work ethic and his deep-seated devotion to the people of his state, the state of New Jersey. These are attributes that would serve all of us well and served him well and are something we can all and should all aspire to. Senator Lautenberg's legacy will be forever woven in the fabric of American history. His work on the new GI Bill of Rights has helped ensure that thousands of America's fighting men and women receive the support they need when they come home and the opportunities to become part of the next greatest generation. With his passing, the Senate has lost its final member of what we all know or have come to call, as Tom Brokaw did, the greatest generation, the World War II generation.
the generation that my dad served in as part of the Army Air Corps and flying B-17s in World War II. My father-in-law, who was landed on Utah Beach on the second day of the Normandy invasion. These were great Americans, and it's due to their sacrifice and their contribution they made to our way of life that has made it possible for America to remain the envy of the world. We're also reminded that our time here in this chamber is fleeting, and we should be humbled by that reminder. There have been 43 new senators come to the United States Senate since 2007 alone. The reason I counted that up is because that was the last time we took up immigration reform, a subject that we're going to turn to here perhaps next week. 43 new senators since 2007, and perhaps we'll have 44 by the time we turn to that topic next week. We're reminded that it is our duty as Americans to ensure that this chamber will host future generations of great Americans as well. As Senator Lautenberg goes to his rest, my prayer is that his loved ones can take solace in the fact that he played such an important part in the great American story with honor and integrity. Mr. President, on another topic, the events of the last few weeks have thrown a spotlight on a culture here in Washington that I think threatens the very fabric of what I just spoke about that Senator Lautenberg fought for and contributed to, one that would hopefully instill confidence in the American people that what's happening here is in their best interest, and that people realize that we're the employees of the American people here to serve their interests, and that should be our primary focus. But unfortunately, we've learned that a culture of intimidation has arisen in Washington that unfortunately has become all too pervasive and threatens to be that cancer that can not only destroy the public confidence in their federal government, but also destroy the nature of our democracy itself. We've learned that IRS agents, we don't know how many yet, but we do know that some were deliberately targeting different political groups because of their political activities. Of course, remember that this is activity protected by the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. And if it weren't for the political activity of the American people, we wouldn't have the great democracy, which is the envy of the world. But we've learned that the Internal Revenue Service was asking these different groups inappropriate questions about their donors, their positions on various issues of the day, and the political affiliations of its officers and directors. We've learned that these abuses went far beyond two rogue employees in the Cincinnati field office, and that the IRS headquarters in Washington was involved as well. Of course, the initial story that this was confined to a couple of self-starters and free agents in Cincinnati was laughable. We've all known bureaucracies enough to know that no one, particularly at the lower to mid-level, instigates any sort of initiative as bold and as toxic as this without some sort of approval from on high, whether it's implicit or explicit. We've now learned that senior officials in the IRS knew about these abuses at least 2 years ago, and yet failed to notify Congress or the public. We've learned that one activist in Texas, one of my colleagues, Catherine Engelbrecht in Houston, Texas, was targeted by multiple federal agencies, including the IRS, the FBI, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and OSHA. We've also learned that the Environmental Protection Agency is yet another agency that has discriminated against political organizations that they don't happen to agree with. We've learned that the Obama administration, in the form of the Justice Department, has treated a reporter as if he were a criminal simply for doing his job. Now, I've seen the explanation of the apologists at the Justice Department. They said just because they identified James Rosen as a potential criminal co-conspirator, they never intended to prosecute him. Well, this is part of an affidavit designed to get at certain records that Mr. Rosen and his family maintained, to invade their privacy. And it makes no sense that they would claim in this affidavit, in order to get the search warrant, that he was a potential criminal co-conspirator, and at the same time say they never intended to prosecute him. Those are simply incompatible and inconsistent. We've also learned that the Department of Justice has conducted a disturbingly intrusive and broad investigation into the phone records of journalists who worked for the Associated Press. At the Department of Health and Human Services, we've learned that Kathleen Sebelius, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, has literally been raising money from private companies that she is responsible for regulating in order to fund Obamacare. That's a conflict of interest, is the most charitable thing you could say about that. And we further learned that this culture of intimidation has also given way to a culture of cover-ups and misinformation. We've learned more about the Obama administration's dishonest portrayal of the September 2012 terrorist attack that killed 4 Americans in Benghazi, Libya. We've learned that the Obama State Department punished U.S. diplomats, whistleblowers, for cooperating with congressional investigators. Sadly, these abuses are part of a larger pattern that goes back several years. For example, in 2010, when we were considering the matter of Obamacare, various health insurance companies began alerting their customers about what they believed the impact of Obamacare would be on them, and that specifically, if passed, it would force them to raise premiums on their own customers. Secretary Sebelius at the time threatened to punish these companies and bar them from participating in the Obamacare exchanges if they followed through in communicating with their own customers about what the impact of this legislation would be on them. By the way, the same IRS official who led the division to target political speech is now in charge of administering large portions of Obamacare, which depends upon the Internal Revenue Service to implement so much of it. At a time when the Internal Revenue Service has lost credibility with the American people, it has no business administering a law that will affect 1/6 of our national economy. The same culture of intimidation that we've seen at Health and Human Services and at the Internal Revenue Service has also been prevalent at the Justice Department, that should be the bastion of justice and equal treatment under the law, but sadly is not. The case of Fox News reporter James Rosen is only the latest example. In recent days, we've learned that DOJ officials tracked Rosen's movements, got a search warrant to examine his private emails, and even obtained his parents' phone records, and treated him like a criminal, which is quite remarkable because, as I said, he was simply doing his job. Mr. President, I'd ask unanimous consent for 2 additional minutes.
Without objection.
As the Washington correspondent for the New Yorker magazine noted, quote, "It is unprecedented for the government in an official court document to accuse a reporter of breaking the law for conducting routine business of reporting on government secrets." Now, I believe national security leaks should be investigated, but what about going after the leaker? We recognize that when you target reporters, it's especially sensitive given the role